All right, hello and welcome to the International Postdoc Forum for Philosophy of Science, hosted by the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. My name is Alan Love. I'm director of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science, and happy to be with you today. Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to take a moment and highlight the rationale for this particular forum. It emerged from the pandemic and the observation that many people lost conference and workshop opportunities to present their research due to cancellations and restrictions on travel. And as we adopted the virtual format, we realized that this allowed us to do something we otherwise weren't thinking about doing, which is showcasing presentations from international scholars, to which we could add commentaries from the local Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science community. So that's kind of where it started, but it subsequently has become a very popular venue and an opportunity that we wanted to continue. And so to this day, we do continue that with approximately 2 every semester, 2 in the fall, 2 in the spring. So with that, let's introduce our speaker for today, Kate Nave, coming to us from the School of Philosophy, Psychology, and Language Sciences at the University of Edinburgh. Kate's presentation is entitled Facts About Failure, Reproduction, Stability, or Self-Production. Kate, the floor is yours.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. I will just get my slides up. Great. Hopefully everyone can see that. Let me know if you can't. So as Alan said, I'm currently a researcher at the University of Edinburgh. And my work currently mainly focuses on trying to look at sort of work in philosophy of biology on agency and normativity and how it can help with issues in how we think about agency and normativity in cognitive science. So I kind of want to talk a bit about the kind of certain problems that cognitive scientists might want a biologically grounded account of agency to solve, and go through one particular view of goal-directed agency that has become kind of recently quite popular in terms of the idea of goal-directed systems as being self-stabilizing systems. I want to talk a bit about why it can't help with the kind of problems we might want an account of goal-directedness to solve, and then sort of very, very briefly gesture to what might be needed to solve that problem. So the kind of central problem for me is that when it comes to thinking about why study of cognition is such a difficult issue, it's often common to point to something like the complexity of the relevant target, so the complexity of the human brain with billions of neurons and thousands of types. But from a philosophical perspective, there's a persistent issue that some people get very tired of but always keeps coming up, is that there is this kind of normativity baked into our concept of cognition, and that's part of what makes it a distinct phenomenon to be studied under a specific discipline, because what determines whether a system is cognitive is typically a question of whether it's subject to evaluation in terms of particular standards, and traditionally they might be thought of as rationality, accuracy, or something like that. And I think that idea that cognition blends together the idea of cognition blends together these descriptive and normative elements is really nicely captured in Warren McCulloch's description of his kind of own work on modeling the logic of neural activity as a kind of experimental epistemology. To say earlier on, the kind of focus was much more on these sort of epistemic norms, but a big kind of change in how we often think about the issue has been this general move towards more evolutionary or biogenic or action-oriented views of cognition as being fundamentally about guiding action to keep an organism alive or to help it reproduce. So cognition becomes less about representation and rationality and more about this kind of pragmatist affair where it's concerning the normativity of a successful action. And kind of alongside this move from representationalist to action first views, there's this linked idea that in getting rid of these representationalist and rationalist views of cognition, we're also getting rid of all this problematic, confused and outdated baggage in which we view cognition as a normative phenomenon that's subject to success and failure evaluations. And that view of cognition as being this normative phenomenon, as something as being intentional or purposive, as something that we can evaluate as being successful or failed. Sometimes that's blamed on philosophers for confusing these poor neuroscientists with their very conceptually laden descriptions of behavior. And so Busacki says that these descriptions have been inherited from philosophy rather than emerging from objective investigation from the brain itself, and that's the problem. But it's also often commonly attributed to the kind of naive or common sense folk psychology that someone like Paul Churchland argues is so totally defective that it needs to be completely replaced by the kind of objective descriptions that neuroscientific talk can offer. So I kind of want to focus on 2 points. I want to firstly argue that talking about action control rather than representation or rationality or accuracy doesn't in itself get rid of this philosophical problem of normativity, because the concept of action and what differentiates actions from mere movements depends upon this notion, this difference between success and failure, just as much as the difference between a representation as opposed to mere similarity depends upon the notion of misrepresentation. And I think it's quite common to sort of respond to that by going eliminativist or instrumentalist and just saying, well, that distinction is not a real distinction in the world. So another reason I think we should preserve it is this idea that we can get rid of that description and neutrally describe what the brain happens to do, I think is misguided. And I want to sort of argue that if we get rid of these kind of ideas of purposiveness, then we're not going to find the kind of objective descriptions of what the brain or body is doing that eliminativists often want. And that's because the description of a tendency or a regularity of behavior isn't theory neutral. When we're looking at the brain or the whole body, there's always going to be multiple contradictory descriptions of the same behavior. Multiple descriptions that are compatible with the kind of past regularities of that system, but that make different predictions as to what counts as continuing the same pattern of behavior going forward. And I want to argue that the only way to provide an objective means of selecting one description over any other is to go back to trying to provide a robust account of this normative dimension of an action. So an account of what the purpose of the action is, what goal it's supposed to achieve. So as I said, there's a tendency to think as though just saying that cognition is for action kind of solves our problem. It gets rid of all this baggage around the truth, the kind of truth and accuracy in representation and success and failure. But, action still has that concept of success and failure, and I think kind of in kind of Anscomian terms, an action is distinguished by the ability to ask the second sort of why question. We don't just ask about what caused the action, but about what it was supposed to achieve, about the reason for that action. So we can make a distinction, in theory, in the case of action and agents, between what a system actually did and what a system actually did and what it was supposed to do. So we can make a distinction between a system that fails to do X and one that merely happens to do Y instead. And that's not a distinction that comes up in ordinary scientific descriptions, or at least in ordinary physics descriptions. If you have something like a pendulum and you've described the sort of laws of motion for that pendulum and the coefficients of friction and so forth, you can derive exactly what its behavior will be. And once you've done that, there's no further question about should the pendulum have done that, has it succeeded, has it failed. The only sense in which we can ask those questions is in terms of relative to our purposes, did it succeed and fail doing what we wanted it to do? And then that kind of pushes the question back to what makes us the kind of systems that can have purposes such that we can confer them onto these kind of systems. So the main focus of why should we care about legitimating that distinction between a system that can succeed and fail and a system that merely does what it does. The main focus of this talk is going to be arguing that without an account of that distinction, we don't have a neutral objective description of mere activity or mere regularity. But there are some other reasons that we might care about it that I think it's worth mentioning. I think one of those is that when we're dismissing a kind of sort of folk or common sense way of talking and saying it should be replaced with a more rigorous scientific way of describing a system, it's always, I think, a much better or stronger argument if we can not just eliminate the common sense ways of talking, because common sense ways of talking might be flawed and they might be misguided, but they do tend to evolve for some sort of reason. And it's always going to be better if we can kind of reconstruct what that motivation is. So why do we make these success-failure distinctions for certain types of systems and not others, and certain types of behaviours and not others? And I think that's becoming particularly important with regards to the development of increasingly complicated machines and artificial intelligences that are increasingly challenging our notion of what counts as an agent and what counts as an action. Simply saying that that distinction is misguided and there's no real fact of the matter doesn't really address why we feel like we need to answer that question of whether or not these systems really are agents that have goals of their own and that can be directed towards achieving certain things and can fail by their own lights, or whether they're just systems that we attribute goals to in relation to our purposes. So I think the kind of traditional view, certainly in philosophy of biology, is if there's any way to naturalistically secure a success-failure distinction for non-design things, it's going to be natural selection, and particularly the differential reproductive success of certain traits, behaviours, or structures over others. And so as Karen Neander puts it, the idea of natural selection is supposed to be how the biological notion of a proper function can be both teleological and scientifically respectable. Now, I think it's fair to say it's pretty controversial whether this does give you a real success-failure distinction or whether it's a way of eliminating these ideas of purpose and normativity. But I think it's probably less controversial that there's a general idea that if anything could legitimate talk of purposes and functions, it would probably be something like this. And I think there's two reasons for liking this kind of selected effects way of thinking about teleology and function. Is that it seems to do the two kind of things that we need our account of success or failure to do. The first thing is that we don't want to say that every single system that is out there has some sort of function or purpose. We want to distinguish purposeful systems from non-purposeful ones. We want it to be like a meaningful category that cuts at something important in the world. And differential natural selection via differential reproductive success does do that. It restricts purpose talk to only the class of systems that have a history of differential selection of a particular trait among ancestors of that system. And that's not a trivial condition. So a rock might be round, but because there's no history of differential reproductive success of ancestor rocks that explains why this rock is round, we don't speak of the roundness of the rock as being the purpose of the rock. But I think an even more important thing that natural selection allows us to do, and that's why this is often called the selected effects account of function, is that it allows us to distinguish between effects of behaviours within a particular system. Because any trait, structure, or behaviour will have multiple effects, and the problem is identifying which of those is the purpose or function. And so by looking at which of those effects was responsible for the differential success of ancestors possessing that trait, we're able to identify a prioritised effect in terms of the one that's responsible for the presence of that trait in the population today. And that's kind of vital if we want to fix facts about what counts as success and failure. Because if there's no way of prioritising a particular effect, then there's no way of establishing whether a change in effect is a failure or just a different way of achieving a same success. So just to take a kind of simple example, if a deer's antlers are involved in two different behaviours, jousting with other deer and collecting vegetation, if they then warp and morph like this to some sort of like tumour, they can no longer fight deer, but they can still collect vegetation. So what allows us to say that this deer is now failing to perform the behaviour of jousting rather than successfully continuing to snag vegetation in a different way? Well, it's the fact that snagging vegetation has no role in explaining why that deer has antlers today. What does explain that is the fact that antlers enabled them to joust better with other deer, therefore better success in gaining a mate. And so that's what allows us to say that these deer's antlers are failing at their function of jousting with other deer, and that the effect of merely snagging vegetation is not part of what they're supposed to be doing. So that's just a very kind of basic overview of the rough idea behind these selectionist accounts of function. And on the kind of strictest version of how we would think about this, it would be restricting this account of functions and purposes to only reproducing systems that produce offspring and are subject to selective presses. And nobody who wants a selectionist account of cognitive functions is going to commit themselves to that very strict version, because there's not enough scope for ascribing purposes to the kind of particular behaviours that cognitive scientists would be interested in, so novel behaviours such as giving a philosophy talk, which don't have that history of differential reproduction in that kind of traditional sense. And beyond that, the problem with this kind of backwards-looking etiological view of function is that it doesn't tell us anything about the goals of this particular system today, just about the purpose that a type of trait has played in the past for ancestors of this system. So it doesn't really seem to be getting at what we're talking about when we interpret behaviours as goal-directed, where we're trying to look at what I am trying to do with my behaviour, not what role a behaviour has performed in the past. So as I said, few people hold to that very strict view, and there's a tendency to recognise the need to extend this beyond differential reproduction. So Millikan allows cultural meme selection as one process that could create functions, and both her, Papineau and Shea all allow something like trial and error or reinforcement learning to be a process that can also create functions. That's something that's been criticised a bit, or criticised in a way by Justin Garson, who's argued that these extensions of the selected effects account of function lack an underlying framework for why those processes count as function generating in the same way. It's sort of trying to force things into the same mold as differential reproduction. So he points, for instance, to Millikan's argument that we can think of a behaviour token as being successful if it subsequently produces another behaviour token, as though that's a parent behaviour token and an offspring behaviour token. And Garson kind of describes that as nonsense, because one behaviour doesn't literally produce another. All that you have is this persisting underlying neural mechanism for a behaviour, and as he puts it, neurons and other neural structures don't reproduce. They don't form lineages bound by parent-offspring relations. Instead, there's only differential retention. Some neural structures persist and grow, others wither away and die. So I'm not going to talk too much about the details of Garson's own particular account here, but the general move that he argues for is we need to get rid of the requirement of reproduction altogether as ad hoc. We shouldn't be trying to fit these other processes into a mold of reproduction. All we need is something like selective retention. Or I think there's a nice kind of quote from Donald Campbell on this idea of generalized selection, where it's just variation on differential retention. So if there can be other selective mechanisms behind differential reproduction across generations, what might they be? One classic answer is something like control or regulation is also counting as a selective process, because control systems have a variation in state due to, say, environmental perturbations or internal fluctuations or external forces. And they also have a differential retention of particular states in terms of a stable point, set of states, or a cycle that control system regularly returns to. And a system doesn't need to be complicated to exhibit it, so this is just a pendulum with various ongoing disturbances, and it's minimizing its velocity and angular position. So this looks kind of like it has variation and selection. If you move the pendulum to different positions, it'll tend to return to the same selected state. And so just as with these kind of traditional selectionist explanations, we can identify a particular feature of this stable point to explain why it was selected. So we can describe those higher energy states of the pendulum where it's displaced as being selected out through feedback from friction, which is dissipating energy and causing it to come to rest in that lowest energy state. So the reason that 0, 0 kind of point is selected is because that's the lowest energy state. So we have this kind of selective process. And so this is a kind of view of selection that was also developed and quite popular in the mid-1900s amid all the various cyberneticists. And Ashby describes it nicely when he says, "We've heard ad nauseum that a machine cannot select. The truth is just the opposite. Every machine, as it goes to equilibrium, is performing this corresponding act of selection." So to say, it's quite an old idea that we can generalize selection to any sort of controlled process, any process in which there's variability and a stable state is selected. But it's recently been revived. There's a proposal by Prado and Savarino who describe regulation as essentially being natural selection by other means. But I think the kind of biggest, most influential kind of move that's revived this kind of view that we can have selection as being both the process that's exhibited in control systems and processes of natural selection is probably the free energy principle, which kind of argues that we can describe all of these processes in terms of the maintenance of some sort of stability amid disruption. So the nice thing about thinking about control as a selective process is control seems to capture a sense of selection that's intrinsic to the system itself, not to some property of the history of ancestors of that system. So if it comes to something like the pendulum, we don't actually need to know anything about the design of that pendulum or where it came from to identify what state it's stably selecting. We can just look at its dynamics, look at its structure, and look at how the various laws of physics will determine its behavior at this time and the fact that it's going to select that lowest energy state. It's not a history-dependent attribution. So in addition to serving as a generalization of the idea of selection, this idea of control and return to a regular state is also often argued to serve as a good operationalization of the idea of goal-directed behavior. Again, that's something that was very popular with the cyberneticists in the mid-1900s, and the classic paper would be Norbina, Rosenbluth and Bigelow's 1943 paper, where they proposed that teleological behavior is essentially synonymous with behavior controlled by feedback. And again, as with the idea of selection as control, the idea of goal-directedness as control has also seen another resurgence, the free energy principle being one example, but also say like Dan McShear's work on reviving some of these earlier cybernetic accounts of goal-directedness. And I think this kind of quote from Dennis Walsh and Gregory Rupik kind of sums up the idea nicely when they say that a system manifests goal-directed behavior when it's capable of maintaining a stable end state through the implementation of responses that return the system to equilibrium across a range of conditions. Another advantage of the focus on control is it seems to nicely capture, or it seems nicely sort of consistent with this idea of cognition as a biological phenomenon. The idea that living systems aren't directed towards the sort of academic philosopher's kind of obsession of things like truth and accuracy, but to survival. And we might say, what is survival, if not the control of internal states to maintain those within the bounds of viability? And so we find Ashby again saying the concepts of survival and stability can be brought into an exact relationship. And similarly, in work on the free energy principle, Friston and his co-authors have proposed that the physiology of biological systems can be reduced almost entirely to the homeostasis. This distinguishes biological systems from all other self-organizing systems and provides a naturalized account of the teleology of cognitive systems. So another particular advantage of the kind of control of goal-directed behavior as stable return to a particular state amid disruption is that seems like a nice, objective, empirically tractable account of what we might mean by purposiveness. We have our distinction between success and failure. Success is just whatever state is most commonly occupied, and failure is any kind of deviation from that mean, from that average. And I think, again, another quote from Ashby, who sums it all up very nicely, when he says that the advantage of stability amid variation is it is purely objective, it avoids all metaphysical complications of purpose, it's precise in its definition, and it lends itself immediately to quantitative studies. And similarly, Walsh and Rupik argue that it provides an analysis of purposiveness that depends only upon an observable, gross behavioural property of a system. Okay, so now the kind of problems that I have with this view. So the immediate concern is triviality. If goal-directed control and homeostasis are just a return to stability, and this is nothing special, if as Ashby points out, it's a property of pendulums as much as people, then it seems to really generalize the notion of goal-directed behavior to any sort of system. So even this little wobble doll striving to stay upright would qualify as a directed system that is acting towards maintaining stability. So it doesn't provide a meaningful distinction between agents and objects. It doesn't explain the emergence of an organismic specific source of normativity, which is how work on the free energy principle has often described this. This isn't a new problem. Ernest Nagel, who was one of the early defenders of the goal stability account, describes it as the problem of overbreadth. And he suggests that we should only talk of goal-directedness for systems with sufficient complexity. So we might be thinking in terms of a sufficient number of independent parts involved in achieving the production of that stabilizing behavior. Obviously, that comes by degrees. And so Nagel's argument was that we shouldn't be looking for a bright line between goal-directed and non-goal-directed systems. The problem with that view isn't just that we don't get a bright line between goal-directed and non-goal-directed systems. I don't think we even get an objective spectrum. So Andrew Woodfield pointed out at the kind of time that Nagel was writing that how we construct the spectrum of complexity is itself going to be somewhat perspectival. In the case of the pendulum, we can treat its behavior as just, the plumb bob on the string, or we can analyze it as involving the collective activity of tens of millions of little atoms and all the collective forces that they exert on each other. So when we think about the complexity of the system, even the way we decompose that, and even the way we sort of set up that spectrum of complexity is somewhat perspectival as well. But if you're eliminativist or instrumentalist about this idea of purpose, then that might not trouble you so much. So I think a bigger problem with the stability amid variability view is not just that it can't allow us to distinguish between purposeful and non-purposeful systems in any objective way, but that it doesn't solve the indeterminacy of effects problem because it doesn't allow us to discriminate between the purposeful and non-purposeful aspects of a particular behavior within a particular system. And I think a nice kind of way of getting at this issue is the role of variability in a lot of behaviors. So from the standpoint of control, you might think that variability naturally equates to a failure to control. So there's a tendency for neuroscientists and also behavioral scientists to try and average out variability as just mere noise. But often variability isn't something that can just be extracted from the controlling behavior of a system. So probably the simplest example are things like exploration or chemotaxis, where variability might be what allows the system to move from one particular pattern of behavior to another, thereby enabling it to better explore its environment and find a better sort of more global optima for the stability that it's seeking. And another example that I like is in motor control. So if you think of running, you might take a perfectly regular stride as the goal of a running system. So the target behavior would be something like the stable oscillation, shown in this kind of orange line on that graph there, corresponding to that perfectly regular stride of the runner on the left. And then all the variations in running behavior corresponding to the kind of variability in that blue line would be failures to maintain that perfectly stable running stride. So they're failures at control. But if you take the perspective of a physiotherapist, then that kind of running stride is actually really bad. It's like really bad for your knees. And you'd be much better off running like this little guy like Ralph Wiggum here with a bit more variability in your running stride. In which case, that variation in your regular pattern of behavior, it doesn't make sense anymore to treat that as a failure or a deviation to be corrected, because that's part of the pattern of behavior that a good runner should be aiming to achieve, as long as you want to keep running into your old age. And this is my favorite example, because in this case, what we have, this is a case of vibrational control. And what we have here, instead of like in the case of the ordinary pendulum, where a displacement is countered by an equally sort of balanced force to return the system to equilibrium, what we have here is just a really consistent vibratory driving force that isn't sensitive to the pendulum's position. So it's not feedback control. But by vibrating the pendulum like this, we're able to keep this in a stable sort of position above the pivot point. So it's being completely driven into that stable position by these random vibrations. So it's not that we have a control state in spite of the variability here. It's that the variability is maintaining the stable state. And what's really nice about this is there's this paper by Taha et al. From 2020, where they show that this kind of vibratory control is often involved in how insects actually maintain a stable hovering position, like the hawk moths shown here. And as they describe, that's a mechanism of stabilization that isn't captured by earlier models of insect flight. Because no matter how accurate the models previous papers used are, because they are based on average stability derivatives, they're not revealing these stabilizing vibratory contributions. So because we're focusing on the average behavior and treating this vibration as noise, we're missing how that vibration contributes to the stable behavior. And I think that gets at something, it's a very interesting sort of minimal example of what's special about how a lot of organisms maintain stable states. That it's a stability that's not achieved in response to disruption, but actually through disruption, through variability. Now, the problem with all of these examples isn't that we can't describe the stable pattern of variability under the kind of return to stability framework. So we could just redescribe the variability itself as being the stable goal instead of the underlying regular sort of oscillatory dynamics. But the problem is that, the problem is that when we have two different types of regularity, just looking at those regularities alone doesn't tell us which regularity defines the relevant behavior. So in the case of a reliable oscillation with variation, such as the running behavior, is the goal state that's regularly returned to the underlying oscillatory dynamics in orange, which the system is robustly preserving despite the variations shown in its actual dynamics in blue? Or is the goal state the preservation of the second order regularity of the amplitude or frequency of that variability? Those different descriptions are both accurately describing a regularity in the behavior, and the criteria of stability alone isn't telling us which description to privilege. But then they have different consequences if that amount of variability changes, as shown in the little animation here. On one description, that's just still the continuation of the same underlying regular oscillatory behavior. Whereas on the other description, it's a change from one pattern of regular variability to a different pattern of regular variability. So the question is, when the sort of second order variability in the oscillation changes, are we saying that the system is failing to achieve its previous goal or continuing to achieve the same goal, the same behavior of running with variability? Now, I think what this essentially is just an instance of the kind of rule-following paradoxes that we kind of typically attributed to Wittgenstein, when he says that if we have an account of normativity that is so trivial that every course of action can be brought into accordance with some rule, then we'll also have this problem of indeterminacy, that every continuation of a pattern of action can be made to either accord with the previous behavior in light of one rule, or it can be made to conflict with that behavior in light of another rule. But this isn't just a problem for realism about purposes, it's a problem for a fact of the matter about objective and neutral descriptions of what a system is doing. So it's a problem for how we identify something as a continuation of the same pattern of behavior, or how we identify another activity as an instance of the same pattern of behavior. And I think Susan Hurley kind of captures that best when she kind of describes what she calls her myth of the giving, in like a parallel to Seller's myth of the given. That acts that classify themselves or determine their own content are as much a myth as experiences that classify themselves or determine their own content. Because for it to be determined what we're doing when we act already requires that our act have content. And the nice thing about this is you can see that these kind of issues are exactly the same ones that arise with representational theory of mind views of cognition, where we attempt to map sort of physical transformations in the brain to logical rules or computational algorithms, that there's a triviality and lots of things can be mapped to following a rule, and any particular pattern of physical activity is always going to be possible to map it to lots of different rules. So moving from that norm of correspondence or accuracy or logical consistency to a norm of continuation of the same pattern of behavior doesn't get rid of that philosophical baggage. And we might think that we can look to neural mechanisms instead. So if we want to know what is the relevant regularity, what's the target of a particular behavior, maybe we should just look at the mechanism that produces that behavior. But unlike the pendulum, when it comes to something like the brain, we don't already have an idea of how to divide the brain up into its mechanistic components. We can look at individual neurons, or we can decompose the activity of individual dendrites, or we could look at multidimensional attractors of populations of neurons. And when it comes to activity in the brain, we can look at precise spike timing as being the important signal, or we could instead just look at average firing rate and treat these precise spike timing variability as just being noise. Where the variation in spike timing, for example, is functional or not, isn't going to be any more obvious at the level of neurons than at the level of behavior. In order to know if the variability in the nervous system is functional, we need to know if the variability that it produces in behavior is functional. But neither looking at the level of behavior or looking at the level of neural mechanisms is going to tell us that fact. So as the new mechanists are regularly pointing out, physical objects aren't already divided up into these mechanisms such that we can look at them and use those mechanisms to answer how we should describe the behavior. And so there's a nice paper by Yolande Franklin, I think it's Mark Slaws and Carl Craver, where they argue that we have this circularity. We don't know how to describe the relevant regularities that individuate a particular behavior, so we might turn to the mechanism for that behavior, but we can't identify what the relevant mechanism is in the brain without already having decided on how to classify the behavior that we want to explain. So they and various others have kind of argued that there's no objective description of either the neural mechanisms or of the behavior. There's going to be lots of internally consistent sort of mechanism behavior matchups, but they could be mutually contradictory, and which sort of mechanism behavior pair you choose is going to depend just simply on the interests of the investigator. But they do also, like in a footnote, suggest that there's some sort of danger here of getting stuck in a sort of local optima. And I think that kind of suggests that despite their pluralism, they seem also sort of like negative feedback cycle, a behavior mechanism pair that's not good, that's not ideal. And I think that suggests that despite their kind of pluralistic standpoint, they do seem to believe that there could be some other overarching constraint on what counts as a good analysis of a behavior mechanism, some constraint on what counts as a good behavior and mechanistic analysis of a particular system. And I think that's right. I think there must be, because we may not agree a lot on what the relevant aspects of a behavior are, but we do agree a bit. Our interests in individuations of which way to describe a particular behavior or regularity aren't purely random. And it seems like something else must be guiding our selection of how we describe a stability of behavior beyond just mere regularity. And this is all the not super worked out part of the talk, but I wanted to talk a little bit about what kind of elements I think might be needed in addition to just looking at dynamical patterns and regularities to resolve this question of what's the appropriate description of a regularity. So to take just a simple example, if we have a system in a jar of water and it's got some dissolved glucose at the top and it moves like this, and then we disrupt it and it persistently returns to the same point, we have that same question of how we should describe what it's doing there. Is it moving towards the glucose in green? Is it moving away from the H2O? Is it moving towards the warmer water? The system's behavior up till now has been regularly doing all of those things. So if we move the glucose away, and the system still continues that behavior that looks like it's still continuing the behavior that we saw before, do we say that it is failing to move towards glucose, or do we say that it's successfully moving towards, say, the more oxygenated water? As I said, the regularity of the behavior alone doesn't tell us the answer to that question. But if the system isn't an undifferentiated little white circle, but if it's a little living bacterium, then we can start to look at things other than just the stability of its behavior amid disruption. We can look at what that bacterium needs. So if it's an aerobic bacterium, it needs air, so we can say that its goal is to move towards oxygen. If it's a glucose metabolizer, then we might say instead that its goal is to move towards glucose and it's failing to do that. But we can't say anything like that for a generic little feedback control mechanism, because a feedback control mechanism doesn't need anything. It'll just sit there happily until it's displaced, and it will return to that particular place. But even if we block its return to the stable state that it's been in before, the feedback mechanism is going to continue to exist, even if it doesn't achieve its goal. So the reason I think that we can talk about needs in the case of organisms, but not in the case of feedback control mechanisms, is because in living systems, we don't just have a one-way relationship from the structure of the system to its activity, but a two-way one in which the structure depends upon the activity in turn. So a cell isn't just a mechanism that responds to disruptions, it's an intrinsically unstable structure, and even if it's not disrupted, it needs to be active. It's constantly degrading, and some cells might turn over their entire cell membrane, for instance, in as little as a few minutes, so break down their membrane and rebuild it entirely in just a few minutes. So the whole structure isn't just at equilibrium unless disrupted, it's maintained away from equilibrium by its continuous activity. It's not like this ball that floats on the water unless it's intervened on. It's more like this lizard which only stays above water through its activity. And it's because cells need to continually do things to keep existing, because they can't just sit there, that they have these specific needs. They need specific construction materials, specific sugars and amino acids to construct them into the parts that make them up and which are continuously falling apart. And those needs are specific. Different chemicals will work as building blocks for different cells depending on what enzymes they can produce. So some things will serve the constructive needs of one cell but not another. In contrast, for a feedback mechanism, the environment isn't a resource. It's a source of disruption, and it doesn't need anything other than to be left alone. So as Hans Jonas puts it, a feedback mechanism may be going or it may be at rest. In either state, the machine exists. The organism has to keep going, because to be going is its very existence, which is revocable and threatened with extinction, it is concerned in existing. And I think it's this kind of idea of needs of organic systems that's implicit in how we select regularities to construe as goal-directed, but it's so natural that we don't often notice it. Yeah. Now, that idea of living systems as having that kind of intrinsic instability is, it's a well-covered idea in philosophy of biology. The problem is that in philosophy of cognitive science, that often gets abstracted away from. So we abstract away from metabolism to focus on homeostasis and feedback control. That's particularly kind of prevalent in work on autopoiesis, which is probably the most drawn upon view of self-production in cognitive science, so Maturana and Varela's work, where they begin with the metabolism of a single cell in terms of how it constructs itself. But then they abstract away that concept when they're trying to ascribe what's important about that for something like a nervous system. Maturana and Varela initially abstracted away from that in terms of something like operational closure, which they reduce to, as Varela describes it with Bergin, the operation of a system has this closure if the results of its action remain within the system. So they abstract away from the construction of metabolism to something much more like feedback control. And that's that kind of mutually dependent relationship between a circle of processes is how autopoiesis and self-production is often understood in cognitive science. It's particularly how it's understood in the free energy principle, which I discussed a bit. And so there's an abstraction away from the kind of thermodynamic features that distinguish the autopoiesis and the intrinsic instability of a cell, and a reduction of it to simply something like feedback control. And that's why I think we have these kind of problems of these very general notions of self-production and goal-directedness. Okay, and this is my final slide, so I'll wrap up. The reason I don't think we should do that is because we don't need to we shouldn't when it comes to analysing the brain, because we'll be missing something. We'll be missing the fact that the brain is no more a machine than any other living system. Neurons aren't these stable little wires that energy flows through. They're cells like any other. And even though neurons are some of our longest lived cells, they do have a very fast rate of protein turnover. Some neurons can turn over as much as half of their component proteins in just a few days. And while it's well known that the brain, consumes a disproportionate amount of energy in relation to its mass, What's particularly important is a lot of that energy isn't just used for signal transmission in neurons. It's not just used in spike trains. It's estimated that as much as 40% of that energy budget is used for metabolic production of the very structure that those signals are sent through, for the production of neurotransmitters, structural membranes, dendritic spines, and so on. So we shouldn't think of neurons as wires that energy runs through. We shouldn't say, as Justin Garson does, that there is no reproduction in the brain, just differential stability. Because there is a kind of production. It's not just differential stability. It might not be the production of an offspring, but it's also not just mere stability amid perturbation that allows a neuron to persist over time, because neurons are, like all cells, continually producing themselves. So I think if we want a way to better fix these questions about what the purpose of a particular regularity of behavior and the mechanism for that behavior is, we need to think about how those regularities of behavior are tied in via the body to meeting the metabolic needs of those mechanisms. And then we might be able to start to kind of pull apart which regularities of behavior are part of the purpose or goal of the mechanism that produces that behavior. But obviously that's going to be quite a lot more difficult for a densely integrated network of billions of cells than for a single bacterium. Hence why I think these notions of self-production are often well explicated in the single-celled case, but kind of elided and abstracted away from in the case of neuromechanisms for behavior. So yeah, I think we need to move away from mind as machine to mind as metabolism, and that might help address some of these problems with the goal-directed account that I've described. All right, thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Kate. That was great. So now we will turn to our commentator, J.P. Gamboa, who is a postdoctoral fellow in the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. JP, the floor is yours.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So I have a bunch of comments that aren't necessarily related, and I'll just sort of go through them, I guess, as they came up. So the first thing that struck me was your emphasis on we want an account of success or failure by the system's own lights. Mm-hmm. And my thought there was well, how do we test or confirm what a system's goals are by its own lights? And you seem to want something closer to like reasons. Like an example you gave is like if we need some reasons for why I choose to do something, and my worry here was that this might push us to something that's just too individualistic for scientific pursuit, right? So we don't want a science of why I choose to get chocolate ice cream or something, right? So there's a level at which the system's own lights might be too individualistic to be appropriate for scientific pursuit, and insofar as they're not, and they're more general, then my worry is that we end up orienting around biological fitness, and we're not getting at anything actually distinctive from the selected effects accounts, which you were contrasting with there. Okay, so that's one thing. And then this idea of goal-directedness as stability amid perturbation. So I took it, the initial problem, one of the problems he started with is that the selected effects accounts don't give us, they don't capture the range of phenomena that we want to investigate in cognitive science. But simply appealing to this notion of goal-directedness, I don't think it gives us, it sets the agenda for cognitive science either, right? Because for one thing, the Walsh and Rubik account is really a agential view of evolution or organisms, right? And you're interested in cognition, they're not, but you're trying to bring those things together. But simply, focusing on these goal-directed behaviors, which have these features, that doesn't tell us which goal-directed behaviors are, worth pursuing, which is related to that first worry, right? Like, I have a goal-directed behavior of getting chocolate ice cream. That's not really appropriate phenomenon to explain here. And then one, again, this is, and then yet another issue. One thing that I was unsure about was your emphasis on goal-directed behaviors as involving responses that return the system to its equilibrium. So I think in the Walsh and Rupik paper that you cited, theirs is a little less strict. So they say a goal-directed system attains and maintains a stable end state. So that is what is, getting maintained the end state despite perturbations and impediments. Whereas you kind of add this stricter condition that the responses have to return the system to its equilibrium in addition to achieving that stable end state. And my worry was that that is just too narrow because a lot of goal-directed behaviors, the responses that are taken to achieve the goal might push the system away from its equilibrium, at least temporarily. Or there's a lot of goal-directed behaviors we could think of that are taking systems away from their equilibrium. And I mean, the first thing I just sort of thought of was, neural activity has baseline firing rates. When cells are thought to represent things out in the world or do something interesting, they move away from their equilibrium, really. The firing activity, that's what's interesting from the neuroscience perspective, is that the activity has changed away from its equilibrium in an interesting way, and that is thought to be relevant, right, to explaining the behavior. So it seems like there will be a lot of cases where goal-directed behavior is achieved by responses that are not all taking a system to some equilibrium point. And then I think this didn't end up in your final version. It was in the slides that I got. One thing you sort of emphasized was moving in this direction can help us shed our representational baggage in cognitive science, and which I'm all for, but I don't see how, foregrounding control and caching it out in the way that you have, rules out representations and the hard, representational theory of mind approach. Because for those people, matching your internal representations to the outside world is really the means by which the system achieves appropriate actions and achieve stability in the face of perturbation, right? So just simply having, emphasizing goal-directed behaviors and action, that cognition is for action, that doesn't necessarily push us away from a representational theory of mind, because the representations might be the means by which, or at least that's the way these people think about it, the means by which you achieve those, actions that you're sort of emphasizing. And then actually this is related to that. So that was just to say that the representational theory of mind is not, obviously in tension with anything that you said. And then similarly, the mechanical versus the metabolic mind might be thought of as also just kind of a false dichotomy. So there's a bad way of separating these things, right? And the traditional view, like glial cells, they're just doing housekeeping, neurons are doing cognition and stuff. So that's like one way of separating, what's for cognition and what's for metabolism in a arguably problematic way. But you could just have a more moderate view where you say, what neurons are doing or whatever entities you're talking about is both metabolic and mechanical, right? So as long as you have a more nuanced view about the role of that some of these actions are both contributing to cognition and contributing to metabolism, we don't need to see these as exclusive things. And then I guess this will be my last comment. I wasn't sure on your view, or I guess the agential view of cognition in general, what cognition itself is and how it relates to behavior. Because in a lot of the cases, you seem to just be talking about behavior, And, in the original, cognitive science framework, there's a clear distinction, right? The cognition is internal, it's manipulating representations, which then explains the behavior on the outside. And in here, I wasn't sure what cognition now amounts to. So you're dropping that picture, and we're trying to explain behavior from internal things, but I don't know if have we gone eliminativist, I guess is one way to put it here. Have we inadvertently slipped into an eliminativist, or is view, or are you just kind of taking on board a more extended 4E type view of cognition, and maybe that just didn't come up here? Um, okay, yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, JP. So I just want to highlight before I give Kate an opportunity to respond to JP's comments that we're going to be making a transition into the question and answer time. So if you do have a question, please feel free to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function, whichever you are comfortable with. If you raise your hand, I will be able to have you ask your question directly, but I'm also happy to read it out, and we will begin that as soon as Kate has a chance to respond. And Kate, let me emphasize, you do not have to answer every comment. Feel free to pick and choose whatever you think would be best.
Cool. Yeah, I will respond in the orders of the things that I guess I found most interesting and see how far I get. I think the point about this explanatory framework focusing a lot on individual directedness, and is that even useful for scientific investigation? I like that point because I agree with you that it's probably not clear how it is because scientists want to generalize. I think what I'm interested in is I feel like a lot of my work ends up being scientists want to do certain things and that's fine, but some of the consequences of those practices can influence how people think about themselves. And it's more kind of saying there are ways of thinking about ourselves and our behaviors that maybe don't make it into what the scientist finds useful, but that doesn't mean that they have to be non-naturalistic or kind of spooky. So I want to give I don't think I would necessarily agree that this can't be useful in scientific practice, but that's not my main goal here. I would say my main goal here is to say, how can we have a concept of ourselves as purposive systems, as intentional, as having these real goals in a way that a machine doesn't, that is compatible with scientific practice, that's not, that could be investigated scientifically. So there could be procedures that would allow us to investigate, is this system genuinely goal-directed or not? Is this system genuinely directed towards this behavior or not? Perhaps that won't make it into the kind of investigations that a scientist wants to do when they're generally generalizing about cognition. But there could be a way of, it's in theory at least ideally going to be testable, whether or not a system meets these criteria or not. The last one, what do I think cognition is? So yeah, I am coming at this very much from like a 4E inactivist broadly kind of standpoint. And what that means, I think for me, is I'm sort of caught between the eliminativist and the kind of full-fledged, cognition is about reflection and disembodied thought. I'm very skeptical about some of the ways that people talk about cognition as an internal process, as involving this capacity for reflection and deliberation in an offline manner. I don't think that there's nothing to that. I'm not I don't want to be a behaviorist, and I also don't want to be necessarily an anti-representationalist. I think you can have a meaningful notion of something like representation where you start with a view of cognition as control, or you start with a view as cognition as for control, not to say that control is sufficient for cognition, but something like biological regulation is a part of what cognition is for, and then you can build up a richer picture on top of that. But just to come back to what I wanted to say was that I think if you go in that direction, you won't get as far as a kind of traditional view of what might be involved in cognition. I think we will lose some of the traditional ways of thinking about cognition. But I'm more concerned with what happens if we go in the other direction, which is if we're starting with something like biological regulation, how do we describe that in a way that's not just a kind of very, I don't want to say kind of like naive behaviorist description of behavior. So I think in order to kind of build up that story of what cognition is, which might involve representation, it might involve all of these sorts of things, we have to first kind of start with a much richer notion of behavior than something like regularities and a mere like analysis of dynamics of behavior is going to get us. We need like a richer notion of what makes that behavior normative, because I think the kind of normative stuff happens at that low level. It happens before we get into representation and rationality. And once we can make sense of it there, then we might even have less problems in how we make sense of that higher level stuff. But I guess like the kind of commitment of my position is the interesting issues are the ones of normativity, and we solve them at the level of more kind of lower level behaviors, and certainly online behaviors. The thing about lots of goal-directed behaviors aren't about a return to a stable state. I also agree with that. I mean, that's another reason why I think this view of goal-directedness is the return to an end state. So the distinction between end state and stable state, I think if we just say end state, then it sort of becomes a little bit circular. Like, how do we determine the end state? What's the one we think is the goal? How do we describe when the behavior is stopped? When in terms of return to equilibrium, I don't think anyone means like equilibrium in terms of like, actual thermodynamic equilibrium. So Ashby has a tend to talk of a return to equilibrium, and he just means like a return to a state that is reliably maintained amid disruption. So that could be a non-equilibrium stability. But yeah, I think once you have a view of a system's goals as deriving from its needs, and its needs as being self-production, then self-production isn't necessarily going to require the return to stability. And I think that's a really interesting point that I didn't get to talk about at all. That is another objection to this return to stability view, that it's not clear that everything a biological system needs to do can be well captured by the idea of a return to stability. A lot of things can be good for a system that involve complete transformations of that system and entirely new patterns of behavior. And I think we should still be able to describe those as achieving a purpose insofar as they are compatible with this metabolic self-production. And that's something that the return to stability account doesn't really have an easy way of doing. So I think those were the key things that I had responses to.
Okay, great. So let's transition to questions. I've got a couple of hands up in the queue. So first off, Rick Sims, you should be able to talk now. Just unmute yourself and ask your question.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Nice to see you again, Kate. Loved your talk. And of course I'm very sympathetic to a lot of what you say, being what I would call a cybernetic and activist myself. And I think that a lot of what you say is right, actually, in a number of ways. But firstly, I think you're right about normativity. I think we can't talk about cognition without normativity, and in a sense, talk about successful behavior necessarily involves some notion of goal. And then when you're talking about control systems, that's where I start getting a little bit twitchy, because why? You asked early on. You said the important question is why here, and traditionally people like Millikan and Karen Neander said, well, the way to establish the why is to have a look at longer term processes, longer than the life of the organism, which establish those norms by which we can talk about goals. And then you dismiss that a little bit in your own account, but I just wonder whether it creeps back in. Because as soon as you talk about an organism's needs, I wonder whether the needs are things which are established over longer term evolutionary processes, not in terms necessarily of proper function, but simply in terms of survival. If we take a sort of Harris Escribano view, a sort of adaptive autopoietic view that the organism has this sort of state space, a region in state space, probably a massively, million dimensional state space in which it is viable. And that the organism's goals are simply to move away from the edge of viability of that region. And of course, we're making lots of assumptions that the region is convex or whatever. Then it strikes me that is established that's not an intrinsic goal based on the nature of the organism, but rather based on its evolutionary history as well. So I just wonder whether you've sneaked those longer term processes back in, because I find it difficult to understand what the organism's needs can be without some sort of historical account. So it's a long question. Apologies.
Yes. Sorry, I just lost the screen a second ago. So I think in some ways I would draw some compatibilities behind how I want to think about goals. Sorry, I've got multiple screens going and I'm trying to find the Zoom screen. And the selectionist view. I think it's almost, because one way I think about it is that you have this kind of process, these productive processes happening over multiple timescales. So in the individual organism, previous a previous sort of time slice of that organism produces the next time slice of that organism. And in a species, a previous generation produces the next generation. So there's a sense in which the process of the continuity of a productive process, which I think defines a cell, could also define a population of a multicellular organism or a population of cells. So there is an extent to which this could be a multi-scale account of goal-directedness, or of purposiveness. So in that sense, it is actually quite liberal. I just don't want to ascribe this to any sort of machine that's not got that biological capacity. I'm not sure if I'm speaking to your question, but maybe one thing that would speak to your question is what I think this kind of focus on the self-production of the individual organism does do, and one way in which I think it allows you to identify goals that don't depend on an evolutionary history, is when you have a system that changes its structure quite dramatically. So an example I sort of tend to like is if you have a bacterium that takes in a little plasmid, a little section of DNA that enables it to produce a new enzyme, that changes what things in the environment can meet the needs of that particular bacterium. So now, let's say it can metabolize glucose when it couldn't before. And because we can look at the new structure of that bacterium, what kind of instabilities it has, what kind of enzymes it can produce, how it can construct itself, and use that to say that now this new chemical, that glucose, can serve the needs of that bacterium when it couldn't before. And there's no kind of selectionist history that can give us that story, because that plasmid might not have even come from the same sort of evolutionary lineage. So it's an entirely sort of novel structure with a novel capacity that has novel needs that even that bacterium didn't have before. And that's not something the sort of historical selectionist account of functions would give us a function for, but I think a focus on what the instabilities and capacities of that particular bacterium structure at that particular point in time can give us a different story there. But yeah, I'm not sure if that spoke to your question.
Yeah, but then to what extent is that still a self? Is it self-producing?
Yeah, how do we identify that bacterium is the same self over time? I think what I want to say is that that if we're looking for biological selves, that we can't make sense of those in terms of stabilities of any sort of invariant features of the system, just because biological systems can transform themselves in these ways. So I guess I end up with quite a processual view of selves. So what makes that bacterium the same self as before is that, at this subsequent time step, it's the direct product of the activities of the previous time step. It couldn't exist without its own sort of previous version of itself. But that bacterium can also be part of a larger self that's a larger process made up of multiple bacteria.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rick. Let's go to our next question, which is from Rob Wallace. Rob, you should be able to talk now.
Yes, thank you very much, Kate. I appreciate your presentation very much. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a neuroscientist, not much of a biologist, but some things that came up. The notion of the problem of the kind of conceptual normativity, and I'm not sure if we're going to be using it in the same way, but the way these things are kind of trafficked in, almost as if it's the bedrock that's not to be spoken of, right? And I think it's very good that you're touching on that. But to what extent can we push that though? I mean, is there the notion of a dehistorical epistemology itself ideological? I mean, I would imagine that a historical approach that speaks about the means by which the societies we live in imprint upon those concepts would be vital here. I think Christopher Caldwell does a lot of that work in the direction of evolutionary biology. I mean, he was only around for a few years and not much of a biologist himself, but I think that would be foundational. I think there's a group dedicated to looking at the socio-historical epigenetics of something like parasites like Chagas disease and leishmaniasis, and I mean those things go back all the way to the Pangea, and they're drawing on the historical trajectories over all that time to explain in part how some of its evo-devo reactions toward present day things that confront, whether it be our public health, whether it be historical capitalism, impose its solutions. The parasite solutions draw out from the solutions it drew. Drawing solutions from millions of years ago to, in other words, everything old is new again for these parasites. And so, in other words, I think a more explicitly historical approach might help you differentiate the various parties here of debating over the notion of consciousness, or well, there's a distinction here. You talk a lot about cognition, but it's certainly different from consciousness, right? The immune system itself is a cognitive apparatus, even though it doesn't have consciousness. So, but into another dimension here, the failures of AI, for instance, come not just from the failure of the insistence on modeling AI on the human mind without all the regulatory stuff that you mentioned, right? Because why? In part because they have a bad model of what the human mind is, but in addition, they have other objectives, right? Their objective is to make profit in the next couple of quarters, and there's a race for that. And they get to do that because the damage that comes out of that is externalized on the greater society. And so these, not everything's a capitalist plot, but there's an element of every, and you drew from a very extensive literature going back, I don't think you got to the 19th century, but there's a lot in there, and that each of these waves of approaches were influenced by their particular historical moment that may have influenced what is described or as normative. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not sure if I have a question there other than offer the possibility that more explicitly socio-historical approach might help name the normative impulses that scientists bring in, and the spontaneous philosophies of the scientists that Althusser writes about trafficked in here. In to do so in a more explicit way may help us clarify that the distinction that the commenter brought up of how do we want to avoid the the notion of a science of the one, but if we can get at well, which impulses are culturally bounded or historically bounded, then that can help us start to distinguish, some of the other things that you've brought up here.
Yeah, I like that point. I think it's something I think about a bit. It's not something I necessarily have time to like talk about when I'm talking about all of this stuff, but I definitely think it's a relevant kind of lens, particularly with the cybernetic view of control, right? That was so tied into particular kind of political and social viewpoints. I think the sort of very like loose and broad thing I'd say about this is a particular appeal of focusing on grounding, a particular appeal of focusing on making sense of purposiveness in terms of self-construction rather than just control, for me, is firstly that thing about making sense of how construction is this very individualistic process. And it's not individual, sorry, it's both individualistic and not. And I think that's what's really nice about it, in the sense that how the system constructs itself is going to depend on the particularities of each individual system, and what is a way of constructing is very different for each system, but your ability to do that is entirely dependent on the broader systems that you're a part of. So it's something that I think can get at that dialectic between the individual and the whole, the society that it's a part of. That construction, self-construction over time, may be a better way of getting at that sense of how the purposiveness of behavior is both necessary, got to involve an element of the individual and an element of the broader systems that they are a part of. And the other nice thing about it is that it might be a way of getting more at a kind of creative normativity, whereas the control view of normativity is obviously very much, at least on the kind of, which I think is fair to say, like a very crude version of it that I presented, there are more sophisticated versions, is going to be about keeping things the same, a normativity of staying the same, whereas something like the way in which an organism constructs itself over time provides us a way of thinking about what the system is supposed to do that makes more space for kind of transformative kind of changes. And that's interesting in terms of not just how we think about organisms, but how we think about societies and how they construct themselves. So yeah, I think this stuff is really like which particular normative framework we have in mind when we try to assess the purposive behavior of a particular system. I completely agree that it is often shaped by kind of background socio-political ideas. It's something I'm interested in, and those are my sort of vague thoughts on it. But yeah.
Right. I would thank you. I appreciate that. One last note would be that as far as your last slide, folk like Richard Levins have done a lot of thinking through about how populations move through the parameter spaces that you were describing, and where an effect in one part of the parameter space becomes a cause in another part. And so, classic dialectical biology, but I think I think that's difficult for many biologists to grasp, because there's a physics envy, a desire to, which by the way, the physicists have also abandoned this point, but we still hold on to notions of being able to engage in that kind of, T+1 temporal explanation of how, a system moves by Markov from one area to the other, without understanding that biology is very much as deep a historical field as one imagined, maybe not as far back as cosmology, but the notion that those histories can be drawn out of multiple ways, and as you described, can ping back and forth between cause and effect.
All right. Thank you, Rob. We're going to move to our next person in the queue. That would be Corey DeCheer. Corey, you should be able to ask your question now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this talk, which I found very interesting. It touched on many things that I know very little about. So I'm going to limit my question to one of the few things that I have some background knowledge on, which was the pendulum. And as I understood your talk, one of the main goals of the account that you're offering is to distinguish genuine behavior that is appropriately described with normative language, such as success and failure, from behavior that is not appropriately described in that way. And the short version of my question is basically whether you think your account is a like strict alternative to the control style accounts, or whether you think they're describing like different notions of success and failure in that sense. So to go back to the pendulum example, just to make this clear, it seems to me that there's a pretty clear sense in which a pendulum can be described as failing to get down to its equilibrium point. And it would be easier if I could draw this, but I'm sure you can imagine me like holding the pendulum up at an angle so that it can't get there. And it's like, it's trying to get there. You can't see me making scare quotes, but scare quotes around trying here. It's trying to get down to that equilibrium point, but it can't. It's failing to because I'm holding it. And that seems to me like there's a decent sense of success and failure there. And that we can use that in other places in physics as well, but that it might be a very different kind of success and failure than the kind that shows up in these metabolic contexts that you highlight at the end. So I was wondering if you think basically whether these are just two different senses of success and failure, and they're both good senses, but it's important to distinguish them, or if you think that there's some like really important like success and failure is really just the metabolic case, and this other sense should only be understood metaphorically.
Yeah. I think I want to say it's the kind of annoying philosopher thing where you want to tell other people how they should speak. But I do think there are good reasons for wanting to avoid using failure terminology too liberally. And in the case of, say, a pendulum that is being held up away from the equilibrium point, you can say it's not because it's not returning to the equilibrium point, it's failing to return to the equilibrium point. It's not that can't sometimes be because you as an observer have identified a particular state, then you can say that the system is not doing what you have chosen to identify. Sorry, it's quite late here. I'm losing it a little bit. Yeah, sorry. It's simply that in that case, what counts as the thing that the system is failing to do is always going to be the choice of an observer, and that's fine, I guess, to use metaphorically terms to describe, within a particular framing where you focus on that state, this is a deviation from the state that's been selected. But I do think there are good reasons for preserving a distinction between intrinsic successes and failures and successes and failures relative to a particular explanatory frame or a particular interest of an observer. I guess that's all I'd say, is that there's lots of, even in the case of, say, something like ought, there's lots of kind of nice philosophy papers disambiguating all the various senses of ought. And, you can have the glass ought not to have broken because I didn't expect it to break when I dropped it. And that's a very different sense of ought from the kind of normative ought. So I think I guess what I should probably just say is that we can have a normative sense of failure and a non-normative sense of failure, where one is just didn't do what I predicted or didn't do what I desired, and the other is the system has genuinely failed by its own lights. But I think once you have an account of a system that can fail by its own lights, then that enables you to constrain your explanatory practices with respect to that system in a way that they're not constrained with respect to a system that doesn't fail by its own lights. So in the case of when you're holding the pendulum up, you can describe it as failing to go to the equilibrium point, or you can describe it as succeeding at staying where you've held it. Both of those are equal. There's nothing about that pendulum that determines which of those explanations is the right one to use. And so there's nothing about that pendulum that determines how you should decompose it in order to kind of explain the behavior that you've selected. Whereas in the case where I think we have a way of fixing internal to the system, what it needs and therefore what it should do and what it can fail to do, I think that allows us to constrain our explanatory practice with respect to that system and how we decompose it in a way that's a bit more useful than just saying, it depends on our interests as observers. So I think it brings something quite substantial that a kind of casual use of failure talk as just a deviation from some state that I as an observer have selected doesn't.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer.
Sorry, it took me a long time to get there. But...
Thank you, Corey. All right, I want to take host prerogative and ask you one final question before we wrap up. And it has to do with the relationship between the account that you are building up in the talk and some other work that you didn't mention as much along the way, which is primarily described as the organizational approach. So you highlighted some of antecedents and Maturana and Varela. We've got a contemporary school of philosophers and biologists, theoreticians interested in sort of articulating a view about how you would get normativity in terms of the sort of system structure and closure of constraints that also puts a strong accent on metabolic maintenance through time. So this is kind of an invitation for you to just say a little bit about how you see what you're doing in relation to that other body of work that seems to have some shared resonance.
Yeah, that was all the work that I rushed through mentioning at the end. And largely what I would say is I think what I'm trying to do is explain why that work is useful to this particular problem in cognitive science. So there's no sort of attempt to I like the constraint closure account. I think that does a lot of the stuff that I want an account of normativity to do. I obviously only talked very briefly here about the kind of positive story. And if I was to flesh it out more, it would be largely in those terms of constraint closure or, work task closure in the way that Kaufman describes it. I think what's cool about that more recent work is precisely how it addresses this issue that I mentioned in Maturana and Varela's work, where when they try and generalize away from cellular metabolism, so autopoiesis in terms of the cell, in terms of chemical production, they often end up with this overly general notion of self-production, this idea of operational closure, and that there's a need within the kind of inactive approach that builds on Maturana and Varela to find a description of what is normally referred to as autonomy, that is both more general than cellular metabolism, but more specific than operational closure. And I think that's exactly what something like the constraint closure account does, because it gets at the fact that what's significant is that we have a structure that's enabling activities to happen, that rebuild that structure. And that does not come out adequately in a lot of the inactivist cognitive science sort of work on autopoiesis and autonomy, I think. And that's what's led to a whole lot of confusions. So I guess how I see what I'm doing, I'm just trying to say that if you're an activist, if you're someone who likes Maturana and Varela's kind of starting point, and if you want to make sense of action, cognition as being in the service of action, and that's somehow being tied to autopoiesis, then looking at that kind of constraint closure stuff is going to provide a better framework than something like the free energy principle or this kind of stability amid variation view of goal-directedness or feedback control, that, moving away from the kind of cybernetic view of goal-directedness towards more like what, Moreno, Mossio, Monteville are doing. I think I just want to sort of show why that can solve some problems in cognitive science. Because I think I remember you asking me, what does that account do? What work does that do for people? For me, this is what it can do for cognitive scientists.
Yep. No, great. Super helpful. Thank you very much. So we've come to the end of our time, and I just want to say a big thank you to Kate for a great talk and being with us here today, even though it's late there across the pond. And we also want to thank JP for his commentary and appreciate that. And thank all of our audience for being here with us today. And look for the next installment of the International Postdoc Forum come November. We'll make announcements in advance to let you know more about that. But until then, you can find out more by going to our website, mcps.umn.edu. Thank you very much, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.